Welcome everyone to the webinar, Moral Injury, Expanding Our Understanding of Trauma. The webinar is part of the Mental Health and Psychosocial Support research webinar series that is hosted by both the IFRC Reference Center for Psychosocial Support, but also the Research Network for Mental Health and Psychosocial Support in the Red Crescent movement. The research network really tries to bring together academics and practitioners to discuss topics and trends and new developments on research in our field of work. And the webinars are one of the ways that we try to do that. Today's webinar focuses on the concept of moral injury. It's a concept that's been increasingly popular over the past year to describe, and now I have to read, the lasting psychological, social, and spiritual harm caused by actions that transgress a person's deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. But what does that actually mean? This is what we'll try to unpack today in the webinar. And we'll do that by asking three main questions. First, what is the concept of moral injury and how does it expand our understanding of trauma? The second question we're posing is, what does the research on moral injury in relation to refugees show us? And finally, how can we use this concept in relation to humanitarian workers? To help us unpack this concept, we've invited two panelists to join us today. I'm very pleased to welcome Angela Nicholson, who's an associate professor and director of the Refugee Trauma and Recovery program at the University of New South Wales, who's been working a lot on this concept. And I'm also pleased to welcome Ferdinand Garoff, who's a psychologist at the Center of Psychotraumatology and Finnish Red Cross. And I'm very pleased to welcome both of them today, and probably they can introduce themselves a bit more when we start. Angela, are you with me?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you okay.
Wonderful, thank you. So thank you so much for the opportunity to join this very important discussion today. I'm really delighted to be here and to be able to talk about a topic that I think is extremely important. As Cecily mentioned, I'm Associate Professor and Director of the Refugee Trauma and Recovery program at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia, where I suspect it is quite a bit warmer at the moment than where many of you are. We've got 32 degree temperatures at 8 p.m, so maybe a little different to the temperatures in Europe. So today's webinar obviously is on moral injury and how this concept can really expand our understanding of trauma. And I thought to start with, I'd just like to share with you a little bit about how I became interested in the concept of moral injury in trying to understand the impact of refugee experiences in terms of mental health and well-being. So I'm a clinical psychologist and I've been working with individuals from refugee and asylum seeking backgrounds for around a decade now. And I remember very early on when I started seeing clients from these backgrounds, not long after I finished my training, I started to notice that certain kinds of experiences and clinical presentations were coming up again and again. And these were things that I didn't necessarily feel very well equipped to deal with in terms of the training that I'd received in psychotraumatology. And what I noticed was that many of my clients were really struggling with the existential aspects of the things that had happened to them. So I remember a particular client who was a torture survivor who just found it so difficult to understand how one human being could inflict this kind of violence and degradation on another person. And he was really understandably very preoccupied by this idea, given it really challenged his beliefs and his notions about the way in which the world worked. And so I saw this happening quite a lot, and found it very difficult to know which sort of clinical tools in my toolbox were going to be adequate to help someone grapple with these kinds of issues. But I also noticed that for many of my clients, the kinds of events that really haunted them were not necessarily the experiences that we would consider the most traumatic or the most fear-inducing, with fear being one of the ways we've traditionally conceptualized trauma. And I remember another client who had been through a number of different human rights violations, had been beaten, had witnessed terrible things happen to other people. And he was really haunted by an experience where a police officer had slapped this man's wife in front of him. And he felt very, very angry about this having happened, but he also felt very ashamed because he, in that situation, had not been able to protect this person that he loved. He saw this as very much part of his duty, and this really, went against what he felt his role was, and so it played over and over in his mind. And what I noticed is that the kinds of experiences, the kinds of symptoms, the kind of clinical presentation that people were showing were not necessarily fitting within the sort of PTSD criteria that I had been trained on, and I was looking out for with my little DSM-4 sort of checklist in front of me. And I saw much more, as well as the fear-based responses, I saw a great deal of anger, of shame, of humiliation, of helplessness, of hopelessness. And I really felt at that point quite unsure where to look in terms of how to help my clients be able to really manage the distress associated with these experiences. And one thing that I noticed about these presentations that kept coming up was that many of them seemed to have a moral aspect. They seemed to somehow be, people seemed to be very haunted by experiences that went against their basic morals and values, whether that be experiences that other people had other events that other people had perpetrated, or whether it was things like my client with his wife, who felt that he had not been able to intervene, that he'd done something that was against his moral framework. And at that point, I came up against, and I found in the literature, this idea of moral injury, which, as Cecily mentioned, can be defined as the lasting psychological, biological, spiritual, behavioural and social impact of perpetrating, being victim to, or bearing witness to acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. And this seemed to me to be a little bit closer to capturing the experience of these clients, which was not just around mental health symptoms, that it was broader than that. It was social, and it was spiritual, and it was behavioural. It was all of these things in terms of trying to understand what the impact of these experiences were. And this concept at the time was being elaborated and continues to be elaborated by Professor Brett Litz at the VA in Boston. And so I actually went and did a postdoctoral research fellowship with Brett, where we tried to look at how this construct might actually apply to survivors of human rights violations. But when we look at the literature to date on moral injury, the concept itself is very old, and it really comes out of the idea that soldiers in a warfare context come up against ambiguous moral situations, and that if they're unable to integrate these moral situations into their existing frameworks, they may experience distress or harm or moral injury. And really, a lot of the literature around moral injury, at least initially, very much focused on the psychological impact of ethical challenges in warfare, but in particular killing. So what does it mean for someone to, take someone else's life? How do they cope with thinking about that experience afterwards, particularly when this is something that, may have been part of a role that they had in their role as a soldier, and then they've come back to civilian life, and how are these things integrated? And that's really where I think the moral injury concept started. is in this particular context. Now, in the military literature, to really simplify things enormously, there have sort of been three different facets of moral injury that have been focused on. And the first of these relates to moral injury self, or the feeling that I have transgressed important moral rules. And an example of this would be a soldier killing, for example, a civilian. The second one is related to moral injury other. So I may have witnessed someone else transgress important moral rules. So this may have been, a soldier witnessing some kind of atrocity being perpetrated by someone else. But then the third aspect that has been focused on is this idea of betrayal. So I've been betrayed by someone else. And often in the military context, I think this is focused on the institutional hierarchy within the military. So maybe a commanding officer gave me an order I didn't agree with, that I had to carry out, and I felt that was a betrayal, for example. Or maybe I wasn't supported adequately by the people around me. And the important thing here, I think, is that different patterns of psychological symptoms, different presentations have emerged according to the kind of experience that the individual reports. So this feeling of transgressing important moral rules has been associated with anger and greater suicidality. Whereas the feeling that someone else has transgressed important moral rules has also been associated with suicidality, but also symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And the feeling that I've been betrayed has been associated with anger and feelings of PTSD. And so what we're sort of starting to see is that the constellation of psychological experiences that people might have after being exposed to an event they felt was morally injurious can really differ according to the way in which they perceived that event or that experience. So, it does beg the question, in what way might moral injury be relevant to the refugee experience? When we're talking about a soldier in a warfare context who may engage in killing, for instance, that sounds very different to the experience of many of my clients who have, been forcibly displaced as a result of violence, warfare, persecution. It's a very, and who don't have, they're not within that military institutional context. So at first glance, it can be difficult to see how these contexts may actually relate to one another. But I think when we look, very basically at the UNHCR definition of what a refugee experience is comprised of, we can see that a refugee can be defined as someone with a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. And so when we look at the idea of persecution underlying that, we can start to see that this is necessarily a moral area. This is necessarily an area where definitionally moral transgressions are being perpetrated in order to facilitate this process of persecution. So what we can see is that many people from refugee backgrounds or asylum-seeking backgrounds are exposed to systematic human perpetrated violence on the basis of some valued aspect of their identity. And that these events typically may contravene deeply held moral values. These are traumatic events, these are assaults, these are torture, these are ways in which an individual's identity is being denigrated. But then even above and beyond that, we've got the situation where people are then forcibly displaced to contexts where they're completely dislocated from important support structures, which may be really critical to helping people overcome the impact of these morally injurious experiences. So if we just think about, for instance, an example of what a journey of someone from a refugee background might look like. We might start off in the home country where there has been war, conflict, persecution. People may be then displaced to a refugee camp or a neighbouring country for an extended period of time. They may then be forced to take a perilous journey to try to find a country of resettlement. And then they may face numerous challenges when they arrive in the country of resettlement. Now, at each of these points, we can see there is the potential for events that can really transgress these deep morals and values that are held by the individual. So, for instance, we might have someone who witnesses the bombing of a hospital in their home country, and thinks about that in terms of how hospitals are supposed to be safe places where the sick can be taken care of, and that's sort of a social contract. That's their purpose, and the bombing of a hospital, really contravenes that on a basic level. We might see that this person was forced to leave their elderly parents in their home country, and in their for them, that may be a really important moral obligation they have, is to take care of their parents in their older age, and they may just be unable to do that. They might be forced to flee. They may have young children they have to take care of, and so we can see there might be feelings of guilt and shame, and even a sense of having transgressed one's own morals in that situation. We might see a sexual assault that has happened in the context of the camp, which again is a very deep moral transgression. We might find that the person has had difficulty providing medical care for their children on the journey to the country of asylum, which again, they may feel that they are transgressing important morals by not meeting the needs of their child, even though this is not something they're able to have control over. And finally, we may see that, when an individual arrives in a host country and applies for asylum, they may be denied a permanent visa, and this may be experienced as a very deep moral transgression also, that they have fled persecution, they've been seeking safety, they've been seeking protection and asylum, and that's not provided, and that may be seen as a sense of sort of deeply breaking the social contract of how the world should work. And so as we've started to look into the concept of moral injury in the context of the mental health of refugees and asylum seekers, what we've seen is that there are a broad range of potential events that could be experienced as morally injurious depending on the individual. And it seems to be potentially considerably broader than those that have been examined in the military context, simply because of the number of types of morally laden experiences that individuals from a refugee background might be exposed to throughout the asylum journey. So please do let me know if you have any questions or comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what we're talking about. I'm going to present very briefly now here just a couple of research studies that we've been conducting to try to start to get some evidence around this idea of moral injury in refugees. But I'll keep my eye on the chat, so please do let me know if there's anything you'd like to weigh in with. So we've conducted 2 research studies looking at moral injury in refugees that have been published. We have another few that are at various stages of being undertaken or being written up for publication even. So I'm just going to talk about the first 2 here today. The very first one was conducted in collaboration with Zurich University Hospital with a team that's led by Dr. Nasser Marina, and also involved Dr. Mathis Schick and Professor Ulrich Schneider. And this is an outpatient clinic that provides clinical services for torture survivors in Zurich and in Bern in Switzerland. And in this study, we had 134 participants who were treatment seeking, so they'd received treatment for a mean of 30 months. And we assessed moral injury relating to others' actions only. using a 6-item measure that we adapted from previous research in the military. So it's asking people, to what extent did they feel troubled by morally wrong things that other people had done? Did they feel distressed by how other people had broken important moral rules? So trying to get at this idea of how much do they still experience distress relating to moral violations that had been done to them. Our participants were mean age of around 40, mostly men. Almost all were torture survivors. Sorry, I'm not sure why that moved. And from a variety of backgrounds. And the first thing that we're interested in looking at was the extent to which moral injury might contribute to some important psychological outcomes that we were looking at, over and above other things that we know are really critical in contributing to refugee mental health outcomes. So when we look at PTSD, what we saw here was that, not surprisingly, trauma exposure was an important predictor of PTSD. The more types of trauma people had been exposed to, the more severe their PTSD symptoms are. And I can see there's a very nice comment there, so thank you very much for making that comment. We also saw that, not surprisingly, over and above the impact of exposure to potentially traumatic events, post-migration stresses in the Swiss context were really important in predicting PTSD. What we found is, even after we took these out of the equation, we controlled for trauma, we controlled for post-traumatic stress, we controlled for age, we controlled for gender, this sense of moral injury, so feeling, sense of moral injury was really a very important contributor to PTSD over and above the experiences that refugees had been through. And in fact, we saw the same pattern when we looked at depression, and we saw the same pattern when we looked at anger, and we saw the same pattern when we looked at quality of life. And the really interesting thing here is that moral injury was the strongest predictor of all of these outcomes. It was stronger in terms of influencing or being associated with these mental health symptoms than the number of types of traumas people had been exposed to and how they were experiencing the post-migration environment. So this suggests there's something really important about being troubled by, being haunted by the moral implications of experiences that individuals from a refugee background had had. So this was a very preliminary study. This was the first study that had looked at moral injury in refugees. It was a very simple study. It suggests that experiencing an event as transgressing moral values is strongly associated with poorer mental health and lower quality of life. The impact of moral injury is over and above that of exposure to trauma and living difficulties. And finally, this is consistent with research on the powerful role of cognitive appraisals in post-traumatic mental health. And I think this is an important point. Moral injury is a specific idea, but it draws on a number of models of post-traumatic adaptation, which talk about how important it is how the individual perceives the trauma. And I think this is really important from the perspective of thinking about moral injury, because if we're going to talk about things being morally injurious, they necessarily depend on your personal individual moral code. So one person may find one particular event really morally troubling, while for another it may be something different. And this draws back on this literature that suggests it's not necessarily about what happens, but what it means to the individual that's critical in influencing mental health. And I think this might start to give us a bit of a clue about how we might be able to best support people who've been through these experiences. Now, I'm going to very briefly talk about a second study that we've conducted looking at moral injury in the refugee experience. And this is a picture of my PhD student, Joel Hoffman, who's been leading this research. So this was a study that we conducted at UNSW in Australia, and we looked at moral injury with 222 participants from a refugee background, recruited from the community in Sydney. So this was not a clinical sample. And here we tried to expand our investigation. So we weren't just looking at being troubled by morally wrong things done by other people, but also this idea of, do people experience distress around things that they felt that they've done that were morally wrong? Now, again, we weren't prescriptive about what these were. This could be really anything in someone's experience, but something that they felt transgressed their morals. So, example of leaving elderly parents behind, or being unable to care for children, or at the other end, we could be looking at people who had forced perpetration, for example, child soldiers, or being forced in the context of torture to harm others, which we know can be a not uncommon experience in settings where persecution is really prevalent. We had, again, a mean of around 38 years, about 50% male. This sample was Arabic, Farsi, Tamil, or English speaking, and they've been exposed to a mean of 4 or 5 different types of traumatic events in the context of persecution. Now, this is a bit of a complicated slide, but it's basically just to say that we were interested here in the idea that maybe this idea of moral injury, maybe the extent to which you feel something is morally injurious, might help us to understand the relationship between trauma exposure and mental health outcomes. So this is coming back to the idea that it's not how much trauma you're exposed to, it's not what type of trauma necessarily you're exposed to, but maybe what we really also need to consider is how you interpret those traumatic events and how it fits with your own moral code. And so the first thing we did was we looked at whether trauma exposure was related to a whole bunch of outcomes, and we found, of course, it was. The more types of trauma you'd been exposed to, the more intrusive symptoms, the more you avoided memories, the more you experienced negative alterations in cognition and mood, the more hyper-aroused you were, the more angry you were, and the more depressed you were. But then we were interested in trying to understand, did these 2 types of moral injury, this was the first time we'd looked at moral injury self, I believe anyone had looked at moral injury self in this group, how did they maybe explain this relationship? What we found here was really interesting. We found that the more types of trauma you've been exposed to, the more moral injury other appraisals you had, the more moral injury self appraisals you'd had. But interestingly, moral injury other was associated with greater PTSD symptoms across the board. So if you felt someone else had transgressed against you, you had more intrusions, you were more avoidant of memories, reminders, you were more hyper-aroused, and you were more likely to experience these changes in mood and cognition. Not surprisingly, you also were more angry and you were more depressed. So this is across the board. These other violations seem to be associated with poorer mental health outcomes across the board. But really interestingly, when we looked at moral injury self, a very different picture emerged. In fact, people with greater appraisals that they'd done something wrong, that they'd transgressed important morals, this was associated with greater trauma exposure as well. They were more angry and they were more depressed. But what was really interesting is we found that the more people felt that they had done something morally wrong, the lower their intrusive symptoms were, the lower their intrusive memories were. And this was a little bit unexpected. And when we really thought about this, we wondered whether this might have something to do, and this is speculative, but with the extent to which an individual felt that they had control over the situation. So if I feel that I have control over a traumatic event, I was unable to intervene in a situation where I saw someone harmed, but I felt that maybe I should have, maybe I really had a choice there. This leads to greater anger and depression, as we might expect, but maybe it also leads to lower intrusions because the trauma itself is processed differently. Then it's no longer a trauma about fear and memory disruption. It's a trauma much more about one's own actions and how one's own actions fit into that context. Now, again, this is speculative. We don't really know why this is, and we've replicated this a couple of times now and are trying to do some experimental work to see if we can figure out what's really going on here. So what does these findings tell us? Well, it suggests that both moral injury other and moral injury self are relevant to individuals from a refugee background. And I think this is really important because the moral injury self stuff is often what I've seen clients struggle with. It's the guilt, it's the shame that hasn't previously been spoken about in this context as much as moral injury other. These two types of moral injury seem to differ in terms of how they're associated with psychopathology. Moral injury other seems to fit more closely with our classic trauma paradigm, understanding the impact of these events, so being associated with PTSD symptoms, depression, anger. And finally, that the moral injury self seems to be a different thing. We don't really understand it yet, but it seems to be associated with PTSD in a very different way. So just to give a snapshot of where we're at in our thinking, what have we learned? Well, it seems that being exposed to these experiences that are morally injurious is linked to poorer mental health. That moral injury may be a mechanism. The appraisal, the thinking about a traumatic event in a particular way might be something that accounts for some of the relationship between refugee experiences and psychological outcomes, and that these perceived transgressions by others and the self are associated with different outcomes. But there's so many things we don't know yet. We don't know what the causal relationship is here. You know, is it that the moral injury appraisals come first, then the mental health outcomes, or the other way around? How do these things change over time in terms of their relationship to one another? Are there certain types of experiences that are associated with moral injury? We can guess that things like torture or sexual assault or forced perpetration might be more likely to be associated with moral injury. And in fact, we've got some very interesting preliminary data to suggest that post-migration stresses are strongly associated with moral injury. But we don't really have this well mapped out yet. And finally, of course, if we're talking morals, this is going to vary enormously according to cultural background and context. And how can we actually understand this? And finally, being a clinician, I'm always thinking about the potential treatment implications. We need a lot more evidence before we can talk definitively about this. But it does make sense that we might need to look beyond traditional trauma-focused approaches to treat moral injury-related psychopathology. Things that come to mind, for example, when we look at narrative exposure therapy, we look at the testimony component of telling one's story and someone bearing witness to this story, and this story then being used in some way for a sense of redress or a sense of, of meaning something. Could that go some way to helping to reduce some of the distress around moral injury? Do we need more cognitive approaches? You know, if we're looking at appraisals, do we need to be really helping people try to look at the way they experience these events in a different way? And there actually is a treatment that's been developed for moral injury called adaptive disclosure, specifically for the military context. Could that be used for individuals from refugee backgrounds? And finally, something that, I find as a clinician very challenging and very important is what happens when these transgressions are ongoing. If someone, for example, perceives or feels that being unable to achieve or being unable to be successful in getting a permanent visa is a substantial moral transgression, which a number of my clients certainly do, how do you address these moral transgressions when they may be ongoing? So that's all from me. Thank you very much to my team and all the collaborators on these different projects. As you can see, we have raised more questions than I think we've answered, but it's certainly an area that we're very keen to pursue because of how important it is in terms of its impact on the mental health and well-being of our clients. So I'll hand over now.
Yes, thank you very much, Angela. This was an extremely interesting presentation, and it definitely unpacked a lot of this concept for me. Before we go into our Q&A, I would like to hand over the word to Ferdinand, who will present some reflection on the third question that we're raising in this. How does this concept relate to humanitarian workers? So let's see.
Thank you very much. I agree. An extremely interesting presentation. What I'll do, so my name is Ferdinand Garoff, and I'm a psychologist from Finland, and I've sort of been affiliated with the Finnish Red Cross for a number of years, and had the pleasure also working at the Psychosocial Center for some time. Currently, I'm working at the Center for Psychotraumatology here in Finland, which mainly has been providing torture rehabilitation to refugees. So this field is quite familiar to me. And I'm very pleased to have heard this presentation because I think it's extremely relevant to the work with refugees, but I think also with other people who are traumatized, sort of that we encounter in the humanitarian work. Now, what I'll do is I'll present a few thoughts of my thoughts about the relevance of this these concepts for humanitarian work, but this is of course much more speculative as I haven't done research on it, so it's more like sort of my reflections and thoughts based on this presentation and my previous readings as well. So one of the aspects of moral injury is, of course, in terms of the care we want to provide to people who've experienced these sorts of events. So one part of it is, of course, as Angela mentioned, is the fact that we might not be looking for the same thing when we try to support these people as you would look for, say, after people who've experienced kind of typical traumatic experiences, where we would be looking for other types of symptoms than just PTSD. We would be looking for these vehement emotions of different types like anger and depression, as Angela mentioned. So we also need the capacity to recognize and address these difficult emotions in our work. So I think that's sort of one aspect of it, is sort of what are we looking for when we're trying to support people. Another aspect is, of course, that sort of moral injury, sort of as opposed to, say, natural disasters, it always implies an other, that is another person who has either perpetrated this injury or who this injury has been perpetrated to, or this violation has been perpetrated to. And in that sense, what we might be looking for in terms of healing as well is sort of focusing, or the need to focus on healing personal relationships or regain trust in others, for example, which is not as prominent, let's say, in PTSD necessarily, if it's something which is more accidental or caused by natural events. The sort of the violations will cause a sort of a loss of, can cause a sort of a loss of trust in other people, as well as one's own capacity to do good, for example, or and so on. It may also impact help seeking. So what you find sometimes is that people, if they feel guilt or shame, they would withdraw and not seek help, for example, or in situations where they've been violated themselves, they might, for example, feel that they're being sort of excluded from the community, for example, for these reasons, and therefore disclosure of these events could be something which they expect to be stigmatized for example, and so on. So help seeking is another aspect which might be decreased in this group, and therefore we should be actively looking for these types of injuries, or we might have to look for these types of injuries much more actively than if we're looking for post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms or something like that. Also, as Angela mentioned as well, sort of what is morally injurious is of course very different depending on the setting and the context. It can be a very personal issue, but it's also very dependent on cultural background and context. So what we might need to do, especially if we work in a setting for a longer period of time and have the possibility for that, is sort of mapping possibly what is perceived as injurious, or what kind of social consequences certain types of moral transgressions have for the individual perpetrating these injuries, or for the person who's been perpetrated against. And also these might have significant impacts on the identity of the person as well, in a different way than what you might get from other types of traumatic experiences. Another aspect which I think is very relevant for the refugee population is sort of the aspect that sort of usually you would, in these sort of situations, you would probably fall back on sort of social structures to heal these injuries, but also to sort of redress. But if you have a situation of forced migration, you might have sort of an erosion of these social structures. So there might not be a way to address these issues in a sort of a forced migration setting or in a displacement setting. Then if we think about the healing approaches, so as Angela mentioned, one aspect is that sort of very trauma-focused specific exposure approaches may not be sufficient by themselves. So what we might need to do is sort of look at these aspects where sort of moral issues are somehow addressed. And how we address them is very important issue. So what we might need to do is sort of be mindful of these issues, but at the same time be mindful of the fact that sort of what is interpreted as morally injurious can be very different in different settings, and also sort of what is morally healing can also be very different in different settings. One option on this point could be sort of to look for group or collective interventions, sort of if we work in a setting where sort of we normalize these sort of somehow or bring recognition to these issues, for example, in a certain group, or bring people together who've experienced similar events, and through that sort of try to build their or empower them and build their capacity in different ways. So that's one sort of options or approach to this, or could be, let's say. Another is sort of thinking about different types of community healing interventions. So thinking about what are the local healing approaches or structures or ways of addressing these issues. And of course, in some cases, they might not be perceived from our perspective as being the best or possible approaches, but at least recognizing the need for or the existence of these kind of structures could be a step sort of forward to healing moral injury in groups of people who've experienced this sort of events. And another thing would be could be the need for attitudinal change to stigma or both injury and perpetration. And that might be sort of something we need to address, but it's of course a very complex issue. Also, as you can see below, one aspect which is sort of often or is mentioned sometimes in terms of addressing moral injury is sort of different types of faith-based approaches, where sort of perhaps more explicitly moral issues are addressed. Of course, in this sort of, you have to be very careful that they're contextually suitable and appropriate for the different settings and people that you try to support. And the last aspect here is sort of course, to remember that sort of in some cases these sort of approaches might be sort of linked with peace building or reconciliation processes, and that sort of could be one step in that direction. But this is, of course, quite speculative on my behalf, but at least this is something to consider when we design interventions in a post-conflict setting especially. And then sort of my final slide here is about the sort of the impact on humanitarian workers themselves. We might sort of one aspect in this is, of course, sort of when we think about ongoing moral transgressions, and we can see this especially sort of here in Finland. I can see it sort of when we have people who work within the asylum system, for example, where people encounter situations which they perhaps are not allowed to address, or it's not part of the mandate of the organization. Another aspect is, of course, the question of capacity. If there's sort of a lot of these transgressions going on all the time, sort of the capacity of the organization to address them or the skills necessary for it might be limited, and that sort of might limit our possibilities to address these issues. Another aspect which sort of this could have a consequence here. We often talk about secondary traumatization, where we think about sort of secondary traumatization as the consequence of trying to address or vicarious traumatization, where sort of people who try to address post-traumatic stress disorder or help people who've experienced traumatic events sort of start to experience stress related to these events themselves. Now, in terms of moral injury, sort of we are confronted with people who have experienced things which probably for many of us would be considered moral transgressions, and hearing about them can be sort of a source of what I here call moral stress, which is sort of the uncertainty or inability to fulfill relevant moral obligations, which means that we might be in situations where we encounter things in our work which we are unable to address, or we don't know how to address. and that creates distress in the people trying to support people who experience moral injury, and might sort of hamper our ability to help them as well. Now, so the constraints in the situation might be one aspect of contributing to this moral stress, but also helplessness in the face of this situation, or guilt, or perhaps cynicism could be a consequence of this. And as you can see, this is quite similar to some of the concepts or consequences that you can potentially experience from compassion fatigue. But this moral component is perhaps something which we need specifically to be mindful of. And finally, sort of, what can we then do in these kind of situations? I'm not going to go deeper into the aspects of actually addressing from therapeutic standpoint the moral injury. Of course, sort of skills and capacities in that sort of could be one aspect, but another aspect which might be relevant in this context is to kind of look at sort of how does an organization engage with these sort of moral transgressions or moral issues. Sort of what is the organizational position on these kind of questions, and what kind of collegial support is present or perhaps not present. One aspect to this is sort of to consider what kind of an ethical atmosphere do you have in your organization, and how, or in your operation, and how do you address these sort of issues there? Are they considered or discussed, or is it more something that is considered not irrelevant, or perhaps not something that you can address? So these were a few of my thoughts in relation to the question of moral injury, but I think there's a lot of room to continue working within this field, and I very much appreciate the research that has been done by Angela and her colleagues in the University of New South Wales. So thank you very much on my behalf at this point.
Thank you very much, Ferdinand. This was a really interesting presentation as well, and I think some really important reflections on what this concept means at a broader level. Maybe at this stage, Angela, I would like to invite you back in to see if you have any reflections on this last presentation, or before we open up for questions. I'm just gonna unmute you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ferdinand, for such a very, very insightful and thoughtful presentation. I think really thinking through, the research is important and all well and good, but what does this actually mean on the ground? What does this mean for people who are facing, helping people recover from these moral transgressions day in, day out is absolutely critical. And I really appreciated your consideration of how, what alternative approaches we might be able to actually use to help people recover or overcome these experiences, things like, collective interventions, community-based interventions, looking at things like reconciliation. When we're considering moral issues, when we're considering things on that broader scale, I think it's absolutely critical that we take a wider lens view in terms of thinking that through. The other thing that I thought was really important that she mentioned was considering what it means for people working with survivors of these experiences. Is moral injury something that can, be transferable, so to speak? I think we've all worked with people who have been exposed to incredibly, extreme human rights violations. We've all worked in contexts where we've felt powerless and helpless, and what does that actually mean for the individuals working on the front line as well? So yeah, wonderful presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a question that came in during the presentation that I would like to invite you to reflect on. I'm just going to read it out to everyone. At some point, could one of you touch upon the relationship between the level of a person's moral values and standards and the injury perceived, and also the ability to transform the trauma?
Would you like to start, Ferdinand? Or?
Sure. I think that's a very complicated question. I mean, in terms of sort of, I think it's sort of I would expect that sort of, I think there's a little bit, okay, let me start again. I was thinking a little bit on this point, maybe of sort of, if you think about sort of the paths to compassion fatigue, for example, where sort of compassion fatigue, to my understanding at least, sort of the starting point for that is empathy in some ways. And empathy, again, is sort of linked to certain values that you hold and so on. But at the same time, sort of this sort of empathic link which you create with the people that you try to support is also sort of the source of the potential compassion fatigue, because then you start carrying sort of, as a consequence of the empathy, you start sort of potentially carrying some of the concerns or stresses of the person that you try to support. So, I mean, in this way, you could kind of, I mean, this is quite speculative, but in some ways, sort of, you could sort of expect that people who are sort of carry moral values, at least similar to the person who's experienced transgressions and sort of perceive these as important. In that way, you could perhaps expect that they sort of have sort of a higher or their risk of experiencing moral in sort of consequences of supporting people with moral injury are perhaps higher. So I mean, maybe you could expect this sort of a link, but I think it depends a lot of sort of people's experience and contexts in general, sort of what's your expectations are sort of for situations that sort of when you have a bit more exposure to situations, you kind of, it's not as unexpected, and in that sense, sort of these sort of transgressions are not as unexpected, and therefore perhaps not as sort of, or hearing about them is not as stressful in some ways. I don't know.
Yeah, I think as Ferdinand said, this is a very complex question. And one thing that I think is very, can very easily and often happen when working with clients who are from, backgrounds who've been exposed to persecution, is it's very easy to get very overwhelmed by these experiences and to feel that we don't have any tools. How do I possibly help someone come to terms with the idea that we live in a world where torture happens? How can I do that? Particularly sitting in my office in Sydney, and so on. But I think that can also be a bit of a mistake, because it's taking on that sense of helplessness. And I think what's really critical in this situation is meeting the client where they are. And so you getting an understanding of this person's moral framework, getting an understanding of how these events might map onto that moral framework, and looking at where the distress and impairment comes from. So with my client, for example, who was unable to, protect his wife from a, from being, denigrated in front of other people, and that was critical for him and really meant something about his sense of who he was as a husband and so on. That's very understandable, but at the same time, what would the consequences have been if he had intervened? What would the moral consequences have been if he had intervened? So helping people to be able to, there is sometimes, I think, some room for being able to evaluate how realistic some of these appraisals are. Now, of course, if you're in a situation where someone has had terrible things happen to them and they feel that they've been transgressed against, and they have, we have to be so careful to make sure that we don't invalidate that experience. And I think Ferdinand's point about there not being a one-size-fits-all moral repair strategy here is really important. So it might be about using faith-based approaches, for example, if that's appropriate, or it might be about finding a way to channel this this feeling of being transgressed against in a way that might be proactive, that helps to reduce the distress. I think it's very difficult to have a single strategy, but it's about meeting the person where they are, and looking for an opportunity to reduce their distress and increase their functioning wherever that may be. And I wish I knew how to do that. I think if we all knew how to do that, we'd be doing our jobs very well. But I think that's the challenge, is figuring out what's the next step there.
Thank you very much for your reflections on that. And I think it's clear that, as you also mentioned, Angela, it's like you've answered some questions, but posed a lot more questions on what this concept actually is and how we can use it both in future research, but also what it means for the interventions and support that we're providing to people. I think we've come to the end of the webinar, so I would just like to thank both of you for calling in and for sharing your research and your experiences and your reflections on this topic. I think it's been extremely interesting to try to unpack, as you said, this relationship between trauma exposure and mental health outcomes, and how we can understand that maybe in a more nuanced way. Thank you also to everyone for calling in from different parts of the world. As mentioned in the beginning, the webinar has been recorded, and we'll make it available. We'll send a link to all of you, and we'll also make it available on our website. And if you're interested in hearing more about the Research Network for Mental Health and Psychosocial Support, I invite you to go to our website, www.peercenter.com or .org, sorry, and you can read more about the Research Network there.